All right, so welcome back to um this channel. So today we'll be looking at UTM 2026 series questions. So far, I've been able to collect 23 questions. So we'll be looking at these 23 questions now. We're looking at these 23 questions today. All right, so let's quickly start. Okay, so alongside this each questions, there's an explanation for all. So I'm looking at the question and the explanation. So let's start. A stream flows at 0.05 meter per second. A boat moves perpendicular and lands at 30 degrees. Find the velocity of the boat. Okay. So the explanation here says um tan theta is equals to velocity of stream over velocity of boat. Okay, velocity of stream over velocity of boat. Okay, so velocity of boat, when you make it the surrogate of formula, it will be equals to what? Velocity of stream over what? Tan theta. Now from the question it says the stream flows at 0.05 meter per second. That is the velocity of the what? Stream. Okay, so 0.05 over what? 30 degrees is what our theta. So it's number 0.75 over tan 30. When you do the math, you get 1.30 meter per second. Alright, over to the next question. It says diverging lengths are always. Alright, so for this question, it's, should I say, a two-in-one question, not looking at the options, because you might see different options from this one. Okay, so this question might are always, it might be talking about the properties of diverging lengths. So just to take note, the properties of diverging lengths are virtual, erect, and diminished. Virtual, erect, and diminished. Virtual V, erect E, diminished D. So that is what VET. Okay. Now the other one here says another name for diverging lengths are concave lengths. Diverging lengths are concave lengths. Then the reverse holds for your what? Your converging lengths. Converging lengths are now what? Convex lengths. Then mirrors, for your mirrors, concave lengths are converging mirrors. Sorry, concave mirrors are converging mirrors. Then what? Convex mirrors are now what? Convex mirrors are now diverging mirrors. Okay, convex mirrors are diverging mirrors. Concave mirrors are converging mirrors. They are kind of opposite of each other for your lengths and mirrors. Okay, so the next question here says, in a step down transformer, the number of coil in the number of turn in the primary coil, is expected to be, number of turn in the primary coil is not that NP. Okay, so the number of turn in the secondary coil will now be what? NS. All right, so it's expected to be greater than NS. NP is expected to be greater than NS. All right, so the explanation here is, in a step down transformer, NP is what? Greater than NS. EP is greater than ES. Okay, then IP is lesser than IS. Now NP, number of turn in the what? Primary coil. NS, number of turn in the secondary coil. EP is the what? EMF in the primary coil. ES is the what? EMF in the secondary coil. IP, current in the primary coil. IS, current in the secondary coil. So you should take note that your step down transformer what? Steps up current and steps down what? Voltage. Step down transformer steps up current and steps down voltage. While for your step up transformer will now what? Step down current and what? Step up voltage. All right, so the next question here is, to experience an increase in pressure of a gas at a constant temperature, the volume must what? Decrease. Why? Because the law states that pressure is what? Inversely proportional to what? Volume at a constant temperature. So if pressure is inversely proportional to volume, if your pressure is increasing, volume will be what? Decreasing. So that is your Boyle's law. All right, so the next question here says, An object that is partially submerged in a fluid of density 780 kg per meter cube experiences a buoyant force of 250 Newton. Calculate the volume of liquid displaced. Okay, calculate the volume of liquid displaced if the gravity is what 10 meter per second square. Alright, so he said experiences a buoyant force. Buoyant force, as you know, should be what? Your upthrust, right? So upthrust is what? PVG. Alright, upthrust is PVG. So there's a mistake here that I would love to correct. Okay, I'm coming. Okay, alright, so it's okay like this now. So upthrust is what? Equals to what? PVG, which is right, which is what? PVG. Now, sorry for the okay, so he says the upthrust is 250, right? I said upthrust is the buoyant force. P, which is rho, the symbol for your density. G is what? Symbol for what? Acceleration due to gravity. V is now what? Volume of the liquid what? Displaced. Since our upthrust is what? 250, then our density is 780. G, which is acceleration due to gravity, is 10. Now it said calculate the volume, so it's running what? Just V. So it will now be what? 250 is equal to what? 780 times what? 10 times V. Alright, 780 times 10 times V. So when you multiply and make V the subject of formula, it will now be what? 250 over what? 780 times 10, which is what? 250 over 7,800. When you do the maths, you get 0.032 meter cube. Now 0.032 meter cube, this is something you should know. Standard form. If you want to change it to standard form, it can be either expressed as 3.2 times 10 raised to power minus 2. 0.032 meter cube can be expressed as 3.2 times 10 raised to power minus 2, or 32 times 10 raised to power minus 3. If you want to convert it to 10 raised to power minus 3 to standard form, it will still be the same thing as 3.2. Alright, because when you are changing this 32, you are removing one tenth from this one, this 10 raised to power minus 3, so it will become 10 raised to power minus 2. 32 will now be changed to 3.2. Okay, so for the next question here, it says what is the value of a capacitor that can retain 8 times 10 raised to power minus 2 joules of energy when fully charged with a 100V battery? What is the value of a capacitor that can retain 8 times 10 raised to power minus 2 of energy when fully charged with a 100V battery? So 8 times 10 raised to power minus 2, you already know is the what? Energy. Then 100V, you already know is what? Voltage. Okay, so it said the value of the what? Capacitor. Now for our explanation here, it says energy is equal to what? 1 over 2 CV square. Now where is this formula coming from? Energy stored in a capacitor can be calculated using this what? Formula, 1 over 2 CV square. Okay, so we already know energy is 8 times 10 to the power minus 2. Then we already know our V is what? 100. So we are asked to look for the capacitor, which is C. So 0.08, which is the same thing as 8 times 10 to the power minus 2, is equals to what? 1 over 2 times C times what? V square, which is 100 raised to power what? 2. So 100 raised to power 2 is 1000. 1000 divided by 2 is 5000, right? So we have 0.08 is equals to what? 5000 C, where C is now what? 0.08 over 5000, which is what? 1.6 times 10 raised to power minus 5 farads times 10 raised to power minus 5 farads. Okay, so now our answer was now in 16 waves. So 1.6 times 10 to the power 5 can be converted to 16 microfarads by dividing it with what? 10 raised to power what? Minus 6. So if you divide 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 5 farads with 10 raised to power minus 6, you get what? 16 microfarads. Okay, now in number 8, it says the electrolysis when the same quantity of electricity is passed through different electrolytes, the mass of substances deposited is proportional to what? Now, you know this formula M is equals to what? ZQ. Okay, ZQ. Now, Q is the unit for Q is coulomb. Q is same thing as what? Quantity of what? Electricity. Q is same thing as quantity of electricity. So Z is now the what? Chemical equivalent. And then in this question they said with the same what? Quantity of electricity, meaning that Q is what? Constant. So we can therefore say M is equals to what? Z, since Q is constant. Now I said the mass of the substance deposited is proportional to what? The chemical equivalent. Okay, the chemical equivalent. So the next question here says, by adding pentavalent impurity atoms to an intrinsic semiconductor material, the number of dash. Okay, so the answer is number of free electrons will increase, right? So one of the major reasons for you to for doping is to what? Increase the conductivity of a what? Semiconductor, irrespective of whether it's pentavalent or what? Pentavalent or trivalent impurity. For the doping is to what? Increase the conductivity of that semiconductor. Now, you know what causes conductivity is what? The presence of free electrons. So if conductivity is increasing, which means the presence of free electrons is also what? Increasing. So this explained what? This question. It said pentavalent doping produces an n-type semiconductor with more free electrons. All right. So the next question here says, a 6 voltage battery delivers current through an external load of 1.25 watt ohms. What is the power supplied? What is the power supplied? Okay, so we know that applying power relating to voltage and resistors, the formula to use is what? P is equals to what? V square over what? R. V square over R. Now I said your V here is what? 6 voltage, right? R is your resistor, 1.25 ohms, alright? So it's now about 6 raised to power 2 over what? 1.25. 6 raised to power 2 is 36. 36 over 1.25, when you do the math, it gives you what? 28.8 watts. Okay, 28.8 watts, which gives us what? A as the correct answer. So the next question, 11, says, the gravitational pull between two bodies of 20 Newton, find the gravitational pull when the distance of separation is doubled. Okay, when the distance of separation is doubled. So gravitational force F is what? Inversely proportional to what? The square of R. F is equals to what? 1 over R square. Okay, so when the distance is doubled, that is R is doubled, so it will now be what? 2 raised to power what? 2. So 2 raised to power 2 will now give you what? 4. So when distance is double, the force will be what? Reduced by what? 1/4, because you know F is equals to what? 1 over what? R square. So 1 over 4 will now be what? The answer. So 1 over 4 times 20 will give us 5 newtons. Okay, so the next question says, when both objects and their image move together in the same direction relative to the observer, object and image move together in the same dimension relative to the observer, then there is no parallax error. There is no parallax error. If an object and its image move together, they are aligned so that there will be no what? Parallax error. So the question 13 here says, a stone of what? Mass 0.5 kg is tied to a string and whirled in a horizontal cycle of radius 0.5 meter at a speed of 4 meter per second. Calculate the centripetal force. So the formula for calculating centripetal force is what? Mv square over r. Mv square over r. Now our m is the mass, which is what? 0.5. V is what? The speed, which is 4. R is what? Our radius, which is also what? 0.5. So we now have what? 0.5 times 4 raised to power 2 over what? 0.5. So 0.5 times 4 raised to power 2. 4 raised to power 2 is 16. 16 times 0.5 is what? 8. So 8 over 0.5 is also 16. So our answer is now 16 Newton. Next question is, Which of the following has the least thermal conductivity? Which of the following has the least thermal conductivity? All right. So the answer there is air. Air is a poor conductor of heat compared to solids and liquids because its particles are what far apart. All right. So when you're talking about conduction, whether electricity or what, heat deals with what, particles, the movement of particles. All right. So if the particles of air are so far apart, air will be the what, least conductor, because before this particle will relate to the next particle, it will take a very long time, unlike that of solids and what, liquids. All right. So the next question here says, which of the following statements are correct about dispersion and colors? One, the color of light depends on its frequency. Okay. So when white light is dispersed by a triangular prism, yellow is deviated more than green. 3. Rainbows are formed when rain falls heavily. So first question, yes, the color of light depends on its frequency. Yeah, very true. Color of light depends on its frequency. The next question here says, when light is dispersed by a triangular prism, yellow is deviated more than green. Okay, right. Okay. So here's the explanation for this question, for this one. So dispersion of light is usually takes this order, rho with, okay, ROY GBIV, rho with ROY GBIV. Arrow is what, red, O orange, Y yellow, G green, B blue, I indigo, V violet. So if you look at it in this order, from red to violet, the angle of this deviation and dispersion is what, increasing. The angle of deviation is what, increasing from red to what, violet. So now if yellow comes before green, in that order I said earlier, if yellow comes before green, which means it will be increasing from yellow to green. Right now here it says yellow is deviated more than green, which will not be what, true, because it's increasing from yellow to green. So definitely green will have a what, the greatest deviation than yellow. So the explanation here says violet deviates most than all, deviates most. Then green deviates more than green. Okay, deviates more than green but less than what, violet. So if they ask you the color with the greatest angle of deviation is what, violet. The one with the least angle of deviation is what, red. Okay, so rainbows are formed when rain falls heavily. It's not necessarily true, because rainbows are formed by the what, dispersion and reflection of light on water, droplets of water in the clouds. Okay, so whether it's raining heavily, it's raining slightly, as long as there's a droplet of water that light can be dispersed through or reflected through, then rainbows can be formed. So one only is correct. So the next question here said, the speed of sound in a solid at 0 degrees Celsius is 1000 meter per second. What is the speed at 25 degrees Celsius? All right. So V1 is now 1000 meter per second. T1 is 0 degrees Celsius, which will have to convert towards Kelvin. Now you all know that 0 degrees Celsius is what? Same thing as 273 Kelvin. Then 25 degrees Celsius is now what? 298 Kelvin. So the formula we have to use here is V1 squared, right? V1 raised to power 2 over T1 is equals to what? V2 squared, that is V2 raised to power 2 over what? T2. V1 raised to power 2, that is 1000 raised to power 2 over 273 is equals to what? V2 raised to power 2 over what? 298. That leaves us, so make it V2 raised to power 2 the subject of formula. It will now be what? 1000 raised to power 2 times 298 over 273. Okay, so when you do the maths, V2, not V2 raised to power 2, V2 will now be what? 1045 meter per second. So C is the correct answer. All right. So question 17 says, the EMF of a cell is the potential difference across its terminals when it is in what? Open circuit. Now EMF is measured when no current flows through a what? Circuit. Now when no current flows through a circuit, it means that the circuit is what? Open. is what? Open. So open circuit because we'll be able to measure it in EMF. So the correct answer is now what? A. Question 18 says 500-watt electric oven plugged into a 220 voltage source will consume an electric current of So now the formula to use here is P is equals to what? IV. P is equals to what? IV. Now making I, because it says the current consumed, so we are looking for what? I, which is what? Electric current. So making I the subject of formula now be what? I is equals to what? P over V, that is power over what? Voltage. Okay, power over what? Voltage. So power is 500 watts over what? 220. So 500 over 220 gives us what? 2.27 watt amperes. So the next question here says a plane inclined at 45 degrees was used to move a load to a height of 20 meters. Calculate the distance moved by the effort. So for this question, distance moved by load is what? H, the height. Okay, distance moved by effort is now what? L, okay, the length. Now velocity ratio is equals to what? Length over what? Height. Okay, so for the same time, velocity ratio is also the same thing as 1 over what? Sine theta. Velocity ratio can be what? Length over height, and it can also be what? 1 over sine theta. So sin theta, we already know theta is 45. Okay, theta is 45. So it will now be what? 1 over what? Sin 45. 1 over sin 45 gives us what? 1.414. Okay, now we said velocity ratio is what? Equals to L over H. So we can substitute 1.414 for velocity ratio, which should have what? 1.414 is equals to length, effort, the distance moved by effort. That's what we are looking for. Length over what? Height is 20 over 20. So when you do the math, 1.414 times 20 will give you what? 28.28, making A the correct answer. So for question 20 says, without considering the containing vessel, what mass of boiling water can raise the temperature of 8 kg of water from 25 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees Celsius when mixed in a heat-proof container? Alright, so the formula to use here is heat lost is equal to heat gain. Alright, so the formula is heat loss, what? Mass times what? Change in temperature is equals to what? Mass times change in temperature also. Then for the heat loss, it will be what? Mass times our change in temperature will not be what? 100 minus what? Temperature of what? The mixture. 100 minus temperature of the mixture. Then heat gained will be what? Mass times what? Change in temperature. Now our change in temperature will not be what? Temperature of mixture minus what? The temperature of the body. Okay, the temperature of the body. Okay, so for our mass, we are looking for the mass of the boiling water. Okay, because the boiling water loses heat to the 8 kg water. Okay, it loses its heat. So it will not be what? M times what? 100 minus 60 is 40. That is 40 M equals to the temperature of this body that gained heat is 8 kilogram. So it's what? 8 times what? 60 is the temperature of mixture minus 25, that is the temperature of the water body. So 60 minus 25 gives us what? 35. So 8 times 35 is now 280. So if you make M the subject of formula, M will now be what? 280 over what? 40. M is equals to 7 kilogram. Okay. So for 21, which of this color is in the visible spectrum has the longest wavelength? So I'll be using this 21 to also explain the other question we did earlier. So if you follow closely, you'll be able to understand what this is all about. Okay, you'll be able to understand what this is all about. So now there's this formula I usually use to answer questions like this. Okay, D is what? Directly proportional to what? The refractive index of that of the visible spectrum of light and D is also what? Direct proportional to what? The change in speed. Okay. D is now inversely proportional to what? Speed. So you should know there is difference between change in speed and what? Speed. D is direct proportional to what? Change in speed. D is now inversely proportional to the word speed, and it's also inversely proportional to what? The wavelength. D is inversely proportional to what? Wavelength. Now D is the angle of deviation, is the deviation we are talking about. We talked about in that initial question. Okay, so if D is increasing, that is angle of deviation is increasing, the refractive index will also be what? Increasing, because they are what? Directly proportional. If D is increasing, change in speed will also be increasing, because they are also directly proportional. Okay, but if D is now increasing, the speed will be decreasing, because they are what? Inversely proportional. D is increasing, speed will be what? Decreasing, because they are inversely proportional. Now if D is increasing, wavelength will be also decreasing, because they are also inversely proportional. Now we said deviation increases from red to what? Violet. I said red has the least deviation, violet has the greatest deviation. Okay, maximum deviation. So if violet has the maximum deviation, also violet will have the maximum refractive index, because it is what? Directly proportional to what? Deviation. Refractive index is directly proportional to what? Deviation. So what? Violet we have the maximum deviation, maximum angle of refraction, and also what? Maximum change in speed. Violet, I'll say it again, has the maximum deviation, maximum refractive index or angle of refraction, and maximum what? Change in speed, because this D is what? Division is what? Increasing from red to violet. Okay, but violet, since deviation is now increasing from red to violet, and D is inversely proportional to speed and what? Wavelength. So violet will have the lowest or the least speed and the least wavelength. Violet will have the least speed and least wavelength. Okay, so if violet has the least speed and least wavelength, red we have the what? Maximum or the highest speed and the highest wavelength. Red we have the what? Highest speed and what? Highest wavelength. Red we have the what? Least deviation, least refractive index, and least change in what? Speed. Red we have the least deviation, least refractive index, and least change in what? Speed. So red has the longest wavelength and what? Least frequency. All right. So 22 says sound is produced in a wind instrument as a result of the vibration of what? Air column. Sound is produced in a wind instrument as a result of the vibration of air column. Okay, because wind instrument produces sound due to vibration of the air column. Okay, so the next question here says a simple pendulum bulb displaces 10 Newton in water, which is the last question now. Displaces 10 Newton in water and 15 Newton in liquid Y respectively. Calculate the relative density of Y. So relative density of Y will now be what? Weight lost in liquid. Relative density of in liquid Y is what? Weight lost in liquid Y over weight lost in water. Also you can say what? Relative density is what? The weight that has been displaced from that liquid over what? The weight that was displaced in water. So weight loss in liquid is what? 15. Liquid Y is 15. Weight lost or displaced from water is 10. So you now have it that 15 over 10 is equal to 1.5. So we've come to an end of these questions, and if there is more questions, you will possibly find them in this channel. So stay tuned for more. like and subscribe. All right.